Thank you so much, Carol, and it's really great to be here. And it's true, Carol and I have discussed the ins and outs of modernism in American cities for a long time, and it's great to be here. One of the things that is so fascinating to me about the shopping center, as it was called before it was called the shopping mall, was how profoundly important they are across most of the American landscape, and how much architects and architectural history has ignored them, with a few exceptions. And I was not a person who went to malls. My other members of my family did, but somehow I didn't. And it wasn't until I actually moved to teach in the suburbs that I said, wow, this is really weird. You know, what is this? What are these things? Having no alternative and going to malls. And then I actually said, okay, you know, how do we find this out? And one of the things I'd like to focus on is that I'm trying to understand modern architecture in America. That is, I'm actually not looking so much at consumerism and how people use things they buy. I'm actually interested in the profession of architecture and how architects doing commercial work put themselves into modernism. How they, you might say, how they learned to be modern, how they applied modernist principles to something that had thought to have was kind of untheorized. And so in some ways the shopping center and shopping was a way that architects who were not the kind of famous architects, let's say, but architects more broadly, engaged modern principles. And they saw them, the shopping center and retailing and modernism, in some ways as sympathetic tropes in how to learn and how to do architecture. And so that's a kind of beginning point and caveat. This is Cross County Center, I don't know if you know it, on Route 95 up in the Bronx. Just recently changed. The tower has been reclad, et cetera, but it's one of my favorites, therefore, and we'll come back to this. So I had to put a skyscraper in, and it's not just a thank you to the Skyscraper Museum to put this in, but it's really not coincidental that Cass Gilbert, who designed the Woolworth, said very famously that a skyscraper is the machine that makes the land pay. And very simply, a skyscraper was the reproduction of rentable square footage. Definition, you know, among many others, of the skyscraper. And so what I would argue in some ways, as a part of my talk, is that the shopping center is as commercially driven an entity and is a horizontal version of making land pay, especially when you go out into suburbs, originally when land was cheap. So I'm finding at least an economic correlation to the production of rentable square footage. Okay. So this is probably the one of the more famous shopping interiors that you might have seen. This is the interior of Southdale by Victor Gruen. I'm going to talk about this image for a little while to kind of put forward a few issues. First of all, and the one that you almost forget to see, is that it's a postcard sent by someone, right? There's a postmark. You see those curvy lines. Somebody thought it worthwhile to send a postcard from this place. So that indicates to us, first of all, that it's something new, something interesting, something that of which a postcard would be made. So it tells us that this is a site to visit. It was something that was unique. And in the 1950s and early 60s, the shopping centers were always kind of big news in the newspapers and the architectural journals that this was a kind of new building type. And that was the word that was used, a new building type in the American landscape. And it was very precise because it combined things that had not been previously combined in exactly that way. So as I say, it was considered new. Other things to notice here, that we are inside. This is, in a sense, the end of my story. It ends in 1956, because for me, this is a kind of culmination point of a whole trajectory across the mid-20th century. And that has to do with the control of space, the control, let's say, of the city, or the control and the making for control of an environment that architecture could kind of take the lead on, and controlling every bit of the environment, from floor to ceiling to walls to planting to sound to lighting to signage. So in some ways, the shopping center, especially this one, the first more or less interior shopping center, was a kind of paramount moment when the architecture could be the most controlling. Think of air conditioning, think of escalators. So in that sense, the interior shopping center is a kind of almost a trajectory of how modernism itself sought to control the environment. In fact, how architecture itself, in some ways, is a kind of impulse to control the environment, with good necessity sometimes, and other times less so. Other things to notice in this image, we have trees, planting. We have a bird cage over here, so there's sounds of nature. We have so-called kinetic sculptures that might move and throw off different kinds of light. And in the way back, on the upper right, you can see Harry Bertoya's sculpture of about 1955. They're kind of abstract, leaf-like, petal-like things, and he did quite a number of those kinds of studies, and they were put into Southdale interior. So in some ways, this is a kind of environment that would create a kind of new urban environment. Now, I use the word urban very, very carefully, because when we're talking about shopping centers, where we use the word urban or suburban, we're already loading the language that we use to discuss space. But I'll leave that as it is for now. That grew in at this point in 1956 was essentially kind of creating the ultimately controlled urban node, a kind of finely controlled machine for selling things. One other thing I like to point out is the woodwork on the fascia over on the left, which is actually very unusual. But in the 50s, the use of wood and decorative surfaces is actually quite common, if you know 50s furniture and that sort of thing. And finally, natural light, which you can see at the upper center. There's a series of skylights in the shopping center. So it's interiorized and yet naturally lit. So some of the signals for creating an interior realm are mixed up here. Everything is kind of scenographic and kind of thrown together as if it were nature to give us trees and plantings. And the light is both artificial and natural. So to me, there's an array of signals here that is quite fascinating for an architect to consider. And the important thing for us to consider is how complete and how total that control really is as an interior realm.
What is that? The signage? That's like a traffic sign? Yeah.
A street sign. Okay, very good, thank you. It's as if, it's a street corner sign. So another urban reference. Excellent, thanks.
London 26.
Say next because it's me changing.
Oh, okay, good. Meanwhile, I do have to betray some of my own predilections and prejudices. I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that I'm a kind of intellectual snob for whom malls are kind of the devil's work, etc. I'm going to just throw that out there because, in fact, my interest in the social critique of consumption is what actually made me so interested in these places in the first place. This is an old op-ed piece. I think you get the point about homogeneity and consumption. Okay, all bad things. But in fact, what got me so interested after I got over my vanity was that, in fact, these are fascinating places because they create, in some of us, because they create a kind of tension about what is urban, what is suburban, what is inside, what is outside, and how is architecture creating a particular kind of environment. Next, please. So I won't dwell on my prejudices too much. So to go back, and I kept going back and further back. I never expected to study storefronts. I was thinking I'd be in the 50s, but I started looking back at what architects in the early formation of modernism in America, when architects were given store work to do. And so these are two examples, not just the architects, but also where they were published. So this is an image of in an article by Knud Lomborg-Holm, who was an immigrant to America, worked at Architectural Record, and he started a kind of technical section in the magazine, and one of the first issues, planning the retail store. This is in an architecture magazine in the technical section about how a store would function. And he used the term, the store is a distribution mechanism for necessary commodities. It was all a kind of rational project. So in some of the modernists looking at consumption and the circulation of goods saw it as a kind of very rational, strict, necessary social function. And thus, the rationalism of modernism was in many ways a kind of a good fit. They saw the needs of distribution of goods as overlapping with the kind of tenets of modernist dogma about rational production and rational society. So Lundberg-Holm was an advocate of this kind of rational distribution system, and the store as a means for showing that. The opposite side of the coin was Friedrich Kiesler, a very well-known architect later on for some of his more avant-garde work, also wrote a book called Contemporary Art Applied to the Store and Its Display. So he was interested in the store not as a kind of rationalist enterprise, but as a kind of almost a fantasy machine. And he would make these collages of storefronts. But for him, the modernism of rationality would also kind of subvert itself, and the store was a place for the enabling of fantasy. So in some ways, this latitude of kind of hyper-rationalism and almost surrealism get at the heart of the problem of commerce. Because commerce is both highly rational, as we all know, it is also, we might say, irrational. That somehow buying and selling things caters to our whims and our fantasies. So both of these kind of threads were inbuilt into store work very early on. And I'll come back to this tension about consumerism. Next, please. This, in the 1930s, as stores were proliferating, in part because of the before and during World War II, there were a lot of new stores selling manufactured clothing, and they grew considerably, especially at the higher end of the scale. Morris Ketchum is a very important architect in this story. He's kind of the not Victor Gruen. We all have heard of Victor Gruen, perhaps. Well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe you're here for that. But in some ways, he was an important and early advocate of modern architects doing store work. And this is a very beautiful photo by Ezra Stoller, and it shows one of the principles that kind of became the modernist credo tied to retailing, which is the inside and the outside are connected. There's almost no barrier between inside and out. The glass almost disappears, and so the acquisition of goods is made absolutely smooth and seamless. And that idea is both a modernist tenet of the simple acquisition of goods for rational needs, but also the fulfilling of fantasy. I can have that thing. It's right there. There's barely a glass line there. So this image is perfectly good for showing us the kind of almost, we are in the world practically. We're practically on the sidewalk. And that moment for me, and I think the photo is clearly staged for that kind of viewing. But notice how the materials go right through the glass, and the cases go right through the glass. So in some ways, some of the things that we take for granted about storefronts, let's say, were part of an experimentation with new possibilities of glass, new possibilities of construction, and were very much part of learning, these architects testing out modernist materials and methods. Now, Ketchum was young at this point, and he became a partner with Victor Gruen almost immediately, and I'll show you that. Next, please. Oh, yes, here it is. Gruen and Ketchum were kind of partners, kind of fake friends. The story goes is that Victor Gruen needed to associate with someone when he came to America, and he met Ketchum somehow, and Ketchum signed some drawings for him. Ketchum obviously tells a different story, but both of them were involved with, and this is a single drawing with a store supposedly by one of each of them, although people disagree about who did what. But what's interesting about it is the kind of demonstration of solid massing on the left, or a kind of total transparency where the street and the sidewalk become a single space. And so it says here, Morris Ketchum architect, Victor Gruenbaum, before he changed his name, associated architect. But in fact, they were both working on them at the same time. So to me, this image explains some of the principles of that. Well, how can the simple surfaces of modernism and the transparencies of modernism become useful to the kind of retailing enterprise? On the right, in the Lederer store, we have that same principle of glass, but also notice the use of the podium with a product in it held up in glass, as if the store is happening before you get into the store. That's something that's new at this period. But on the left, what's also interesting is that we're seeing a solid entrance into an outdoor atrium. So this space behind there is actually outside as well. So in both of these cases, they're playing extensively with the storefront line, with the building line between street and store. And that kind of plasticity, that kind of ease of going between inside and outside is one of those things that I find is an overlap between a kind of retailer's building up of excitement, but also a modernist principle of slipping the boundaries between inside and out. So both of these architects who become important with shopping centers are working through some of the tenets of modernism as they are also learning about the retail trade. Next, please. Meanwhile, you have Morris Lapidus, a very well-known figure in architecture as well. He did quite a few stores in New York in the 1920s and 30s. And in fact, he worked for a very famous store contractor as the in-house architect for 15 years. And what's totally amazing about this store is that he's taken the kind of interior-exterior relationship and made it, as you could expect Morris Lapidus to do, zany, as he put it, or zooty, whatever the word was. So this is an actual a huge display case, and the entrance to the store is on either side of it. This is actually a living room in a case. So Lapidus was playing with a kind of modernist approach, all glass, all can see through at every moment, use of the columns, obviously necessary, but also as a kind of, to play off formally, but creating this kind of fantastic world of desire and of excitement. In fact, he became quite famous for and was took a lot of heat from in architecture in the profession, and he was far more theatrical, and the word theatricality is something that he used extensively, but so did Victor Gruen. And you could say that their early work in the stores and in commerce in general combined a kind of strict visual language of modernism, but also with a kind of the theatrical possibilities of seeing through and having a kind of transparent view into the stores. Next, please. 150th and 3rd in the Bronx.
Oh, Alexander's and Hearst.
But there are a lot of other architects experimenting with modernism through various ways to get work through retailing, and also as different industries retooled after the war towards consumer goods and the production of storefronts, for instance. There was even a higher rate at which architects were drawn into the commercial realm. This is one plate from a book by Pittsburgh Plate Glass. There is a new trend in store design. And this page is by Walter Gropius. So here is, one of the demigods themselves working on a storefront catalog for Pittsburgh Plate Glass and designing a store using PPG's products and doing a kind of signature Gropius, or you could say modernist, piece of architecture. This could be any number of buildings if you know the language of Gropius, perhaps. But the point is that the kind of modernist simplicity, transparency, and kind of and the pursuit of this interior-exterior relationship were a perfect fit, as it was said in the catalog, for the demonstration of commercial and retailing principles. Next, please. But now enters another problem, another question in the landscape. And that, quite simply, is the car and the downtown. On the upper left, we have an image from Architectural Record, which, if you read it, says, this is a Coney Island architecture of Main Street character. This is obviously a problem for the writer. Somehow, this Main Street, which today would be on the National Register, is actually an instance of commerce and architecture and planning gone awry. And what is good is this Washington, D.C., Connecticut Avenue park and shop. The example here is that it has parking by one architect and uniformity. This is good. Very simple. So what we're seeing here is a really interesting moment in which the kind of the shaping of perceptions about what kind of organization, what kind of city, and what kind of planning procedures are the right procedures is really stunning. You know, the kind of cacophony, the mess, the differentiations, all of the kind of variety that we see there is actually a sign of a problem for them. And the unity and the simplicity of this is a positive, and room for the car. Shh, don't say that yet. This was considered by the Regional Plan Association, and this image itself circulated very widely in newspapers and in magazines as a really good example of the problem of the car and the needs of commerce. And that becomes the kind of the really key point that becomes the problem. Here, in almost about the same time, very famous image by Richard Neutra for drive-in market. The West Coast was kind of ahead of the curve in designing outdoor markets, drive-in markets. And so this is something that was considered new and fascinating, addressing the needs of the car in a very rational way, understanding turning radiuses, understanding all the technologies you needed for the car, but also it was a modernist enterprise. It was very much to be expressed as a modern design. Now, there were other forms, obviously. There were, Adobe versions of drive-ins, but this was an example for someone like Neutra, especially coming to the States, to be able to experiment with modern language. Now, this image here is the kind of image that one would ignore when one looking at that image. But it turns out that there's something interesting here. And I'm not going to discuss too much of it. The Grand Rapids Store Equipment Company is a firm that built store equipment, cabinets and stuff. And they also did layouts, and they also did sold equipment. And the only thing I want to point out here is that I didn't put this image together. The magazine editor, Architectural Record, did, Knud Lomberg-Holm. And why did they do that? Auto entrance at the rear with car storage in the basement. That's why that image is here. So the realization that, and it's right here, nothing special at all. But that's what they note. So the car is entering the design vocabulary of different approaches to retailing, and it's beginning to really push on the assumptions that we might say, well, here's a really fascinating instance of a lobby and all that sort of thing. But in fact, that little detail is why it's on the page. Next, please. So in the 1930s and 1940s, and these are only a few images of which there are many, many more, the car and the city, the car in the town, the car and it became a kind of an echo around all planning conferences, architecture conferences, real estate conferences. What are we going to do about the car? How are we going to solve the problem of maintaining a functioning shopping district and fixing it so that the car can still be part of it? So just a quick breeze through. Regional Plan Association in 1936 proposes a diagram where the cores of proposed buildings would be used for parking. And there would be arcades to walk through the building to get to them. One example. The small town of Garden City on Long Island pioneered the idea of taking the back lots, putting a few trees in, and and making parking lots, and even encouraging the store owners to build back entrances into their shops. Garden City became another one of those cities that was studied widely because they solved the problems, so they thought, of getting cars to the traditional downtown. At a much bigger scale, other cities started doing almost the same thing. And this is kind of a diagram that we're going to see over and over again, where these are the two main commercial streets of Anaheim, and these black boxes are proposed and future parking garages or just parking lots. The idea would be that you would make sure that you could get enough cars to the center of the town and people could walk to Main Street. Very simple proposition. During the Depression, a lot of buildings had been torn down. There was available property. And they saw that the back lots or on the back streets would be cheap real estate. And that became a kind of method by which the towns could accommodate the car. I don't even, this is a bigger version by Harlan Bartholomew, where he actually designed a new kind of block of stores that would have parking behind them, but also you can see ramps here for parking garage below. That's pretty expensive and only happened once in a while. But we can see the architects, the planners, the engineers, the politicians trying to reconfigure the relationships of the city between a car, a pedestrian, and a store to make the city work, to make the town work. These are not all big cities either. And this experimentation is something that gets the ball rolling in many ways. Next, please. This is a kind of pause, a fun one, to show you the extent to which it was the problem of the city was understood. In the 1940s, the city of Allentown proposed a similar scheme as we just saw to make parking lots behind the main street. They even handed out tickets, you can get a discount, and somehow they thought to make a game out of it. And so the person who ran the graphics department in the city department of whatever, this is kind of apocryphal, patented a game and then sold it to Milton Bradley eventually, where it was kind of like Monopoly. You move a piece, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, you would draw a card that said, well, you're behind a slow driver, usually a woman driver, it would say. You're behind a woman driver, lose 2 turns. But the basis of the game is that you're still shopping in a town. And most of the time, the cards you draw in the game are that the town is a problem for shopping. So Park and Shop, which had been the program for parking, actually became a kind of demonstration of congestion, of traffic, of not being able to do your chores, because run your errands, because the downtown was too crowded. And so it became a traffic game sensation. And it actually went through various iterations over the years, and the last version in 1976 or so actually was based in a mall. So we can really see the conception of the town, the conception of urbanism as a commercial core, but also as being deeply in trouble in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that all of this is about the problem of getting from the, I can't even see this, from the bakery to the antique shop. You can't get there from here. And that was the problem of the game. And it's very, very, I have a set, I play it with my family. Also interesting, notice oil and coal, heavy grain and feed. So it's clearly an older town with an older organization. And it allows us to see a little bit into the kind of the culture of the downtown in a very important moment. Next, please. So what begins to happen is that architects and their sponsors begin to experiment further. I put an earlier version of 1931 to show that this is not entirely new. There were examples where developers and commercial enterprises experimented with the problem of shopping. So it's not entirely a new enterprise. I just want to kind of throw that out there. But what we get in the 1940s is a fascinating experimentation, trying to rethink, reconfigure the relationship between the car and the street, the shopper, pedestrian, and the store itself. So Morris Ketchum proposed a store block where you'd have a department store below a parking garage attached to an office building. He later went on to propose a more suburban version of a store raised up so there's more room for parking. Or Kenneth Welch, who actually was the owner of the Grand Rapids Store Equipment Company. He got his hand in the game by proposing that the second floor of the existing city of Grand Rapids would become a parking plinth. That you could save downtown merely by putting a roof over everything in downtown. You know, you've got to hope. And so you can see that here, a little example of a courtyard, but for the most part you have parking everywhere. And so what's all about these things, they're all fascinating, but they're also clearly limited by a conception that you need to be able to get the car to the store. So it's still in many ways what I call an old-fashioned urban relationship between buying things and getting to it. So it's always about getting the car to the store. That is one of the key ingredients that's going to be tested at this point. Next, please. Another example, this is Victor Gruen experimenting as well with some more wild forms. This radial design, or this store that was actually built in LA, fascinating because they experiment with the car and the store. Here, the car goes to the roof. Here, the car comes in, drives around, and parks. So that is not a green mall. That's a parking lot. So fascinating though these may be, to my mind, they haven't worked out that pedestrian bit yet, that idea of someone walking. But they're still working with that. And in fact, next please, we'll see that has been going on already as well. And a very unknown proposal by Carl Feiss, who was an architect, but actually more of a planner and a policy person. He put in a strange place, House and Garden magazine, a proposal for a band of stores creating a green zone. Usually it's called for kids or the nursery or something like that, with parking along the perimeter. Here's another one by Raymond Loewy, a very important and popular store designer, where yes, there's parking, but there's a kind of greenway at the core of the project, where you would park and you would walk in this green zone among stores. So this is beginning to turn the formula, turn those elements of the store and buyer relationship. Next, please. This is a very early scheme, and it's not a shopping center. In fact, it's a community center, which means it had government functions and civic functions, etc. It was done by Eero Saarinen as part of the defense project around Willow Run. But what's truly great is that it has this kind of pedestrian zone with arcades, plantings, etc., with parking behind the buildings. So in some ways, this is emerging as a kind of diagram where you would park, go to another pedestrian space before you would get to your destination. Next. And then Gruen himself, the man, as early as 43, even before he did the round one that was not pedestrian-based, he did a proposal in an architectural forum where there was a teeny garden with a water feature, became standard, with parking outside of it, a delivery drive, and you can see a rendering there. So as early as 43, he had experimented with this idea of a pedestrian precinct. In 48, even something that might look even more familiar, but for in Los Angeles, where you'd have parking in these quadrants and a pedestrian way going to the department store. So this is a really interesting and something that we could begin to recognize as that kind of shopping center. Although in this case, with only one department store, and the whole idea of 1 or 2 or 3 department stores, again, was something that no one had any idea about. It's not as though there was a formula. And so some of the early shopping centers were going to be built by the department stores, therefore Gruen put them in the middle. But in these schemes we see, even as they're also experimenting with schemes that don't really accommodate the pedestrian, they're also using pedestrian-based schemes. So in some ways, the late 40s and early 50s are a kind of a true experimentation. No one quite knew exactly. None of the architects understood the degree, the different ways that these things could be combined. And that sense of experimentation, I think, is really fascinating. Next, please. And one of the really fine early projects was this, Linda Vista, a project by, on the West Coast by Whitney Smith. And this really is one of the first truly built out, still small, but a pedestrian-based design with a green space in the middle, sometimes referred to as a kind of town green, sometimes referred to as a landscaped mall in the kind of English landscape tradition. And this is actually part of the defense project also at Linda Vista, and it was fairly temporary. But this is probably one of the really better examples of that realization that a kind of rational planning around the idea of the car and the store and a kind of civicness was finally coming together. This is a proposal by Kelly and Grusin, in New Jersey, where if it had been built, it was also similar, where you had a pedestrian-based core with parking along the edges, in this case, a theater at the edge. So in the 40s, the realization of the necessity to plan and, in a sense, to do site planning that involved pedestrianization was becoming a kind of, okay, I think we're getting there. We're getting close to this. Next, please.
You mentioned defense planning. What was that?
A lot of these towns, like Linda Vista, for instance, also Willow Run, they were built as part of defense industry planning during World War II. A lot of the funding for emergency housing, or they're putting factories in Willow Run, well, they ended up building almost no housing, or Linda Vista, where they did build thousands of houses. They said, well, we're building houses, we also need a school and a shopping center. So some of them, the 40s ones, were defense contracts, actually. Next, thank you. And one of my favorite projects of the period really takes a hold of the pedestrian idea, but interestingly enough, not for a new shopping center. This is a very well-studied project, but it's still one that I think profoundly shows us, and from my point of view, why the term pedestrian modern is neither an urban term nor a suburban term. Because at the time, they were experimenting with different locations, in city and out of the city. And it wasn't considered better or worse for one or the other. We see experiments in suburbs, in small towns, larger towns, big cities, with finding the space for the pedestrian. So this is our main street, this street in Rye. There was also one proposed for Mount Kisco nearby for some reason. This, after a phased period of demolition and clearing, becomes that. Parking becomes a perimeter-based system so that people can walk right into that pedestrian main street. This is called the Rye Plan by Ketchum and a whole bunch of other planners, and I should list all of them because they were very important planners at the time, really studying how to reconfigure the old town that was being, in a sense, suffocated by the automobile, like the shopping districts of major cities. This plan actually was voted down by the town. They didn't want to raise their taxes. But this image in particular circulated very widely, and the Rye Plan became a kind of an important touchstone for a lot of people beginning to say, okay, we need to change the relationship, to modernize the city, to modernize the relationship between car, shopper, and town. Next, please. And probably one of the really, well, to my mind, one of the really important unbuilt propositions that really scaled up the proposition to something we understand was the Beverly Shopping Center, which was built in a different location. You may remember Shoppers World outside of Boston. This was the first version of that for a different site. They couldn't get control of the property. They had to move, etc. Mars Ketchum, again, a large team of planners and economists and department store owners, made this vastly scaled entity. This is something like 2,000 feet And what we're going to see is, to my eye, is how the proposition of the shopping center was a kind of modernist site planning extravaganza. Next, please. And here you can see the Greenway, cinemat, as if it's kind of a Russian constructivist kind of theater. This kind of glass box at the end is actually a home display center, but it could have been it looks as if it's a kind of modernist town plan, which I think it really is. Huge Greenway, seen not as a kind of domesticated small-scale mall, but as a kind of grand, almost serene but abstract outdoor space. Of course, the true client, mother and child, under an arcade, but cantilevered, okay? Not just any arcade, but a cantilevered arcade, because this is a kind of modern way of doing things. And then on the outside, so you can read this section here, that is the diagram of that space. But on the outside, the parking side, what you get is a kind of modernist extravaganza of storefront experimentation. Receding planes, glass panels, overlapping interior and exterior spaces. So in some ways, this is an extension from only a few years earlier of that study by Ketchum for the retail store, of using a modernist expression for this new kind of building type, this new kind of large-scale enterprise. And what we should also get and think about when we're looking at this scale is that one of the ways in which the architects were started to describe these commissions was that, okay, it's for commerce, yes, it's for stores, but it's a complex machine. It's a complex entity with huge site planning requirements for parking, for trucks, for all sorts of air conditioning, for all sorts of servicing. In effect, it's the site planning reality of a small city. That this, in fact, is a kind of experimentation at large-scale planning, which was modernism's kind of holy grail, large-scale planning. Next, please. Gruen also got some commissions for large-scale site plannings for shopping centers. This one was not built, luckily, and as several scholars have noted, it's a good thing it wasn't built because it would have destroyed his career, because it makes no sense. Shows you, again, the kind of the possibilities that they didn't know exactly how this would turn out. Obviously, there's a problem. There's parking on the inside and on the outside. He's not getting the message yet. He hasn't yet confirmed that pedestrian separation yet. Even though these are modernist boxes, again, Gruen always enjoying a kind of symbolic core for the department store, with these kind of vaguely modernist shapes for a pedestrian bridge. But interestingly enough, we see this here, the use of the site plan in section to allow cars to come through, which we've seen, and I forgot to mention earlier, about when I mentioned site planning, a lot of it has to do with varying the grade so that trucks could get in and cars could get over, and so that the functioning of the place could continue. And you get that in several places, mostly here, and they would come through there. And also, that would usually serve as the truck delivery system as well. Luckily, Gruen did get it right shortly thereafter. Next, please. And so what became the norm for a couple of years were places like this. And this is fairly well examined by another historian, Northgate, outside of Seattle. It's hard to get excited somehow, and yet we should, because maybe because it's black and white, we don't all see all the great colors they're wearing, but the essential program here is truly like in a sense that moment when the formula of getting the pedestrian to a place that the pedestrian will feel comfortable being away from the car and not on a street. And so you get a kind of, decent planting, the kind of plastic, or I should say the kind of three-dimensional variations of planes along the ground with arcades and such things. And this, John Graham actually says that he went and studied Rockefeller Center and looked at the dimensions of other shopping facilities, very few of which had been built at that point, but looking at other collective spaces. Obviously, the photograph is taken so as to show us the greenery. So that idea of plowing away, separating the car, and reinserting greenery becomes something that we saw at the very beginning and becomes a key element in the reintroduction of nature into these places. Next, please. This is slightly more interesting. Welton Beckett Stonestown in San Francisco, drastically remodeled as was the previous. And here we see some of the kind of design aesthetic shifts. Is it a picturesque place? Is it a kind of a street? Is it a planted garden? The design of the mall at the shopping center was something that, again, had not yet been clarified. What does a kind of modern institution, this place that is both a civic and a commercial place, how should we design it? How should it work? They didn't do too good a job here by that standard, because already we see the retailers saying, no, I want this kind of front. And obviously that was pretty easy. It's just a layer of wood. But the kind of, is it a street? Is it an urban street? Is it an urban experience? I mean, that's the kind of larger question we should be asking ourselves. Interestingly here, the street ends at a store. And we can start to see how the commercial engine is being figured out, that all of these stores exist to get you to that store, and that is the kind of driver of the shopping mall at this point. But the language here is what I would call modern-ish, for lack of a better term, but it is the architects trying to use the stripped-down language and use the kind of planning model that would give them a sense of a new kind of modern environment. Next, please. This is from the cover, Lathrop Douglas's Cross County. And now we get to see a little bit more of the sense, well, they've been experimenting with the idea of greenery, but this is not a street. This is a kind of garden, as if you're strolling through a garden instead of down a straight paved walkway. So there's different attitudes about what this kind of space is. Is this different than the previous one? Is this more urban or less urban? Is this a picturesque garden, Central Park at the mall? Or is it more of a street that is the mall? And that's kind of, I think, where it gets quite fascinating. Also here, there's a second story of stores, which was quite controversial in the discussions both economically and also architecturally, formally, about what will people go up. Is it more like a city if they go to a second story of stores? Or is it somehow taking away from the main experience of the shopping area? But that's one of the key differences here. But between this one and the previous one, you really get a different, and to my mind, a kind of different sense of, well, what is a modern shopping space? Next, please. Now I have to step back a little bit. I've been very, very focused on what the shopping center architects were doing, and very narrowly. But I do think it's really important to this idea of that the architects were also participating in architectural culture. They were doing architectural readings. They were following the goings-on of all the international organizations. They were not just shopping center architects, which ends up being the trope that we think of with respect to commercial work. And just a quick smattering of some of the work of the period. This group, CIAM, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, was kind of the leading spokesman for a kind of particular modernist leaning group of architects. And their book, The Heart of the City, it has its own story about trying to shift gears or about trying to do different modern principles in the city. And this image of a new town center is from the book. And you look at that as a town center and you realize that that is the language of modernism as a kind of collectivizing device. A modernist vocabulary of creating a walkway with buildings, stores or not, parking behind. And so this is also in the literature of modern architecture per se, not just modern commercial architecture. And so in some ways, we know that not just Gruen and Ketchum, but other of the architects working on this, were following and understanding the planning principles, you might say, not just the aesthetic principles, of how to create a kind of civic core. And that language of civic core was the preferred term than commercial core. Obviously, civic is good, commercial is bad. But that's how this kind of language slipped in the architectural discussions. This project by José Luis Sert, who's also a member of CM in Brazil, a project for a whole city, and this is the town center. And you can see here also a simple language, similar in the kind of blocky form, an arcaded spaces, and in some sense the forms that they are choosing are similar and sympathetic programmatically. This would have a tall building, and I'll show you that in a moment, with a shopping arcade, sometimes auditorial, like we saw in the Ketchum project. And more directly, Victor Gruen himself wrote a book in 1964 about his theory of city and regional planning, and he called it The Heart of Our Cities. I think it's no small thing that The Heart of the City was the book a decade earlier. So he's clearly paying attention, and he actually, he cites when these authors approve a few years later of one of his shopping centers. So he's very aware, and I think many of them are very aware of architectural culture in general, and trying to fit modernist precepts with the commercial programming needs. Next, please. Also in European cities, very much aware in American cities in the 50s, were urban renewal and urban rebuilding that took place in bombed out European cities. This image of the Lijnbaan in Rotterdam circulated widely in America, and the Lijnbaan itself was passed on from publication to publication all across America in architecture, planning, real estate, and this was not just a key to downtowns, but in fact became a key image for shopping centers in general. And it was one of the earliest, built in 52, 53, one of the earliest pedestrianized zones in one of the post-war, post-bombing European cities. But interestingly enough, this very image, the original, was sent by the planner in Rotterdam to Victor Gruen, and it's inscribed on the back to Mr. Gruen, it was nice to meet you, or something like that. So Gruen was very much aware of the kind of modernist / architectural vocabulary that was applied to cities or suburbs. Next, please. In fact, Gruen, in 53, just when he's also doing some of the suburban shopping centers, is also making proposals for closing main streets in small towns that we saw in the 30s and 40s and converting them to exactly now a familiar image of Main Street now with landscape and covered walkways and arcades applied to existing buildings. I mean, one of the key things about the Rye plan and key about this was that these were going to be existing buildings. It wasn't going to be torn down. Now, one of the key parts of this, and I won't touch on it too much today, but the parking, is key. So pedestrianization is one half of the bargain. Parking is the second half of the bargain, and you could say the third half, if I might use that expression, would be the transportation system that would get around them. And that is essentially the language of the shopping center in the suburbs as well. Next, please. So probably one of the crowning achievements for Gruen, even before the enclosed shopping center, was Northland. It was the largest when it was built, and in many ways became really what made Gruen quite famous because of the scale of the undertaking and of the photogenic qualities it supposedly had. You can see here, this is a typical court, and these dark areas here are all outdoor planted spaces. These are all outside, and each one of these is a planter. This is like the North Walk, the Great Lakes Walk. They all have these names. And of course, at the core is Hudson's department store. They were the client. And so what kind of space do we call this? In addition, Gruen took the initiative to create an art program. He said, if we're going to make these civic spaces, if we're going to make these into the kind of places that people will come to for all parts of their social life, we need to have public art. So he commissioned artists. He had a show here in New York of the artists who were commissioned, and he started this idea of not only landscaping, but also including an arts program as part of this, here it comes, urbanity that he sought in these places. And this is what a modern city would look like, even if it was just a node of a city. So for him, it's not about suburb or city, but you could say it was about urbanity, a quality impossible to quantify, woolly in all respects, and yet that was the kind of goal of this. Now, granted, all the art was child-friendly, quote unquote. That's what the literature says. So it's about that sense that this modern city of perfect organization and perfect functions was very controlled, was highly orchestrated and curated. So the bigger scale we get, the more grand the undertaking, the more extensive level of control required. Think of this. Next image, please. Sorry. Yes. This is the west side of the shopping center, and it looks like an urban transportation center. Okay? Buses, imagine, buses. They had buses. This is in the mid-50s. People still actually needed buses. And so there was a whole bus drop-off system. There was the parking lot was split, so you could enter on either level of the shopping center. This is the drop-off zone. Could be an airport. To me, this is a kind of incredibly, and it is, an incredibly complex architectural and engineering feat to design a system of thousands of cars, thousands of people, thousands of trucks, thousands of customers, orchestrated. And the term orchestration is Gruen's, not mine. But the idea is that this kind of infrastructure, if you will, would make possible that shopping center as a kind of modern urban bit, well-functioning, much more efficient than the older city, much more comfortable than the older city because you never had to worry about getting run over, much cleaner, no smog. So in a sense, for Gruen, it was a kind of improved urbanism, and he becomes the kind of spokesman for that. Now, one of the images that is probably my favorite of all is this one. This is a different shopping center publicity image, and this is mom. You know, you're the child sitting in the back seat and driving to the shopping center. You don't see the shopping center. That is the perfect demonstration of the principle of the shopping center as a kind of modernist landscape and site planning procedure. We see people sitting on a lake. We see cars driving over a beautiful bridge. That looks like some buildings over there, beautifully planted. The windshield becomes a kind of view onto this perfected landscape. And that is the image that Gruen and others are seeking for this new shopping center. It is social life perfected, seamlessly working, seamlessly providing you with a place to not just shop and consume things, but to meet others, to have a social life, to have a cultural life. Now, I threw in an image of Olmsted's from Riverside, outside of Chicago, because I think this image is doing the same thing. This image is showing us, that the technologies that make this new landscape possible are just fine and dandy for mom and the kids. There's a kind of naturalization of the landscape taking place here that I think is very, very much alike. The automobile is kind of a piece of us. We are a piece of the automobile, and it's an automobile subject going and traveling through this bucolic, perfect landscape, which is utterly constructed, utterly man-made, and utterly controlled. And in some ways, that is the kind of fantasy of this kind of project, that commerce, the shopping center, enabled the modernist dream of truly controlling an environment. Next, please. So much so that Gruen, in the early 50s, when he was planning Northland, and I point out to you the truck ramps that go below and the split section, was also planning that there should be apartment communities, single-family home communities, office buildings, medical center, university, that this would be, in fact, programmatically speaking, the same as a city, but much more efficient, much more friendly, much better organized. And this was his view of a perfected modern landscape. Of course, based on the automobile, but in every case, the automobile would be left to the perimeter while pedestrians, free and kind of public space participants in the active civic discussions, would always be the core of those new spaces. But look, he's planning a whole territory. Next, please. And I only put this in because we're at the Skyscraper Museum, but the other bit of the shopping center, which I think is quite fascinating in some cases, was each one had a tall building. Each little urban node had a little skyscraper, because that's how you signified what a city is. Well, it has a tall building. So it didn't. Many shopping centers did not do it. This is Cross County, and that's Old Orchard a few years later. But to me, the skyscraper idea legitimizes these images as little bits of a city, really well organized, really perfected, a modern dream. Next, please. Mega scale planning, very famous Fort Worth plan by Gruen. Took a whole core of the city and said, we will raise up that entire city one floor, the entire core. Parking would be in these 6 garages, boom, 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 boom. Services and electricity and plumbing and sewage would run below in this new service base. And the surface of the city would be a pedestrian haven. This didn't happen, obviously, but it became extremely popular and extremely well discussed, because this, in a sense, was the ideal of a modernist city, a perfectly functioning, pedestrian-based city where the technologies were put at bay and yet still functioning, where the car became both necessary but out of view. Next. And here it is, heaven. Skywalks, a perfect, in their terms, a kind of civic, democratic space where citizens could shop, talk, meet, be citizens, if you will, all based upon the pedestrianization. New garage completed. Yay. Next, please. And this is the truly strangest image of all, because this is one of those garages. It's as if we're parking at the Metropolitan Opera and Lincoln Center, all of the cultural institutions combined. I mean, the way these people are dressed, as if they're going to some gala somewhere. But this is the entrance to the city. This is the kind of, if you will, the white middle class return to the city that has now been well organized, cleaned up, and operates like a smooth sounding Ferrari or something like that. I don't have a Ferrari. I don't know. A booth to buy something. This is the dream of this, an extension of all this commercial planning that far outdoes the level of control of many urban renewal projects, of many other modernist projects, but somehow found a way through Gruen and the literature of the time to perfect a city through reconciling walking as a privileged activity and the proper arrangement of the car and the highway. What I'm not showing you here is that this is ringed by a whole highway system as well. So that same system is still at work. Next. So we return to the heart, the perfect environment, the placid, serene, with art, with bits of nature, with a little child moment there, stores, easily accessible escalators. We see now that this is, in effect, which is just after Fort Worth, although he was working on this at the same time, that the kind of the modern dream of the perfect city is finally found when the shopping mall is enclosed, when the shopping center is enclosed in in glass and air-conditioned and perfectly patrolled. This might be a nightmare to some of you. I'm not, I'm still that cynic, but it is still a kind of extension of these principles that have been studied for decades. I think there's one more. Yes. Just a little hint of where I'm going is to take pedestrianization back into the city. The outdoor pedestrian realm was proposed. Kalamazoo was built by Gruen, even though he was already working on these. This is still working, although it's been renovated many times. And for those of you in New York, you know the story of the Lindsay administration efforts to really start messing with the urban fabric, and quite complex, and even ties us into Times Square a little bit. But to me, this idea of the pedestrian serves as a kind of signifier of the degree to which cities and suburbs are controlled by designers and planners, and in some ways the kind of desire of modernism to become to make efficient places, to make smoothly operating places as a kind of ideal of social life really underlays a whole history of American cities. Thank you.
Exciting blast from the past of, if you're like me, or maybe suburban childhood flash before your eyes. And in David's talk tonight, it previewed his PowerPoint, and it certainly brings a lot of deep memories back again. But if you're here at the Skyscraper Museum for the first time, actually let me know how you found out about our program tonight. Those of you who are members know, and because we get in the mail, that we have a book talk once a month, and this is the beginning of our winter-spring series. There are cards in the front if you don't have these already, and you can certainly check on our website. But this, and in case you don't know me, I'm Carl Willis, and I'm the founding director of the Skyscraper Museum, and do most of the shows, and sitting here amongst, and I hope you'll pay attention afterwards, where you're going to have plenty of time to walk around and view Times Square 1984, which is going into its last weeks here. And what we do at the museum is to try to illuminate various little-known episodes of skyscraper history to hit the high points of what's going on in the world today and around the world in high-rise architecture. We like to alternate between New York and celebrating in exhibitions like the 100-year anniversary of the Woolworth Building, and here about Times Square. Our next exhibition, which will open next month, is called 10 Tops, and looks around the world at buildings that are 100 stories or taller and just at their tops. So Skyscraper Museum likes to try to embrace as wide a number of topics and series of themes that we can, that pertain to either New York history, architectural or urban history, and all kinds of urban topics generally. So we're a little off topic, it would seem, tonight, to be discussing pedestrian modern shopping in American architecture, 1925 to 1926. But this is a book that we definitely had to feature at the museum, and David Smiley is a colleague of many years from Columbia, and we've had many a talk over the course of the research of this book, and he teaches in the Department of Urban Studies and also Architecture within the undergraduate school at Columbia in the Architecture Urban Studies programs. He's also taught at GSAP, the graduate school at Columbia, also at Washington University, and courses at Yale. So he's somebody who has been giving serious study, serious thought to both theory and practice in modern American architecture in its broadest sense. Modernism as a way of life, as a context for living, and what more essential part of the majority of Americans who were growing up in, well, the years that I did and well after, and still today, was the urban experience or the pedestrian experience of the American mall. I know I was definitely shaped by having my first driver's license and being able to go to the mall with my teenage friends and walk around, and with my mother in order to sit down and have a nice dinner out at
family
somebody's
time.
cafeteria
Family
and
time.
do a little shopping. It was the substitute urbanism for at least half of America during the years from the 1950s forward. But it had its origins, as you see in this book, in the 1920s, as did the idea of modernism being imported to America and what it really meant to be modern. And to be modern, I think in American sense, meant to be a consumer. So the convergence of these ideas, of the populism of making things for everyone, the consumption of everyday objects that improved your modern life and looking modern in your dress, modern in your consumption habits is definitely at the core of being an American in the 20th century. So I guess David will give us that background and might also reflect on the changes vis-a-vis Times Square and the changes that happened since the 1980s. We were just talking about the kind of flip of a dangerous Times Square, 42nd. And today, the Lion King generation of Times Square, where no New Yorkers go to Times Square anymore because it's just too crowded, right? It's too crowded with tourists. And so the rise of urbanism, of the urban environment, is something which has a trajectory that ebbs and flows in the same way that the consumer and the economic cycle ebbs and flows. So that is not nearly as intellectual and sophisticated a description of the scenario that David will give us tonight, as he takes pedestrian modern as a kind of trope for American culture and civilization.
Such as it is.